The train let out one final shriek before slowly coming to a halt in the dusty station of Riverbrook, a small insular town where time seemed to move only when it was allowed. Amara Wilson stood upright amid the bustling crowd, her deep blue dress neatly pressed without a wrinkle, hair pinned into a tidy bun, and a wide-brimmed hat perched with elegance, all carefully chosen in hopes of making a good first impression on the man who had once written her letters filled with love. But her expectations crumbled in mere seconds, the moment his eyes locked onto her face, then quickly darted away, as if unable to face what they were seeing. You're Amara Wilson?" he asked, voice tight, his arm frozen, the small bouquet in his hand already beginning to droop, mirroring the emotions of its bearer. Amara nodded, her smile fading as she watched the color drain from his face like he'd just seen a ghost in broad daylight. This won't work. You didn't say you were black." The sentence never finished, but Amara understood perfectly what he hadn't dared to put into words. "I think you just tried to say something you never had the courage to write," she replied, her voice calm but sharp as a blade. "And you never asked." The bustling station seemed to slow, curious glances turned toward them, a poised black woman being flatly rejected by a white man. It looked like some cheap daytime spectacle. The pretty hat Amara had once thought a symbol of elegance now felt like bitter irony. 3 weeks on a train, 6 months of passionate letters, a suitcase full of hope, all shattered beneath the weight of a prejudice that had never gone away. "You write so beautifully." "I imagined someone else," Harold said, stepping back as if her presence threatened the image he'd built. "You should have said something." Amara clenched her purse strap, willing herself not to shake with fury. "Said what? That my skin doesn't fit your imagination? You never asked, just wrote pretty words but left out the most important one, truth." Harold glanced around and caught the eyes watching him. He wasn't afraid of Amara. He was afraid of the crowd, afraid of what they might think of him if they saw him with someone society still wasn't ready to accept. "You understand, don't you? This town, my business, reputation," he murmured. "I could buy you a ticket back. You seem sensible, educated." A chill ran down Amara's spine. Not sadness, but a quiet, deep anger she hadn't felt in years. In his letters, he had called himself a lonely widower longing for love and a fresh start. But never once had he admitted that his heart only opened to a certain shade of skin. "I gave everything I had to come here," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "And I have nowhere else to go." Harold fumbled, pulling out some crumpled bills as if money might fix what he'd broken. "Use this to rent a room for a few days. We'll figure something out." Before she could respond, a deep, clear voice rang out behind him, cutting through the quiet like thunder on a still afternoon. "This is how you handle things, Piers. Throw money at a problem and hope it disappears like always?" The story had just begun, but this time it wouldn't end with a one-way ticket home. Everyone turned. From the crowd emerged a tall man, walking with slow, deliberate steps, each stride a declaration of power. He wore a white shirt and dark khaki pants, simple clothes but finely tailored, the kind of modesty that didn't seek attention yet demanded it all the same. His eyes, sharp as a razor's edge, locked on to Harold Pierce, who froze instantly, as if stripped bare before everyone. His tanned face, lined not by age, but by years of labor under sun and dust, carried the weight of someone shaped by seasons, sweat, and soil. Without effort, his presence parted the crowd like water. "This isn't your concern, Maxwell," Harold snapped. Though his voice had lost its edge, His confidence now was a thin shell. Alexander Maxwell, the name everyone in Riverbrook knew, stepped forward again, forcing Harold to step back. "And how is it not my concern," he said, voice like cold steel, "when I watch a man I once called a friend act like a coward?" The air froze. No one dared to interrupt. The people of Riverbrook had heard of Alexander, the wealthiest man in the region, owner of nearly half the farmland, someone even bankers treaded lightly around. But none had ever seen him angry. Until now. Maxwell turned to Amara, and as if shedding a mask, his expression softened, still sharp but sincere. "Ma'am," he said, lowering his voice, warm and resolute, "allow me to introduce myself. I'm Alexander Maxwell." Amara didn't respond immediately. She looked at him, into those eyes, listened to his tone, and felt something stir within her, something unfamiliar yet safe. But life had taught her caution. Kindness from powerful men always carried fine print. "I've a small ranch on the edge of town," Alexander continued. "If you have nowhere to go, I'd like to offer you a place to stay. We have some guest rooms, and my housekeeper would be thrilled for the company." Amara gave a polite nod, more courtesy than acceptance. Her eyes still held a glimmer of skepticism. Riverbrook wasn't made for people like her, and a generous offer from the most powerful man in town, no matter how kind it sounded, wasn't enough to make her feel safe. Harold, nearly speechless, turned to Alexander, his face flushed like he'd been slapped in public. "Are you serious, Maxwell? What will people think?" Alexander gave a quiet laugh, cold and contemptuous. "People? You mean the ones farming my land? The ones borrowing from the banks I back? I'm curious, too. What will they think?" Harold's face drained of color. He knew Alexander Maxwell wasn't just a farmer, he was the town's backbone, the man whose nod could mean survival or ruin for dozens of families. And now, that man was standing up for a black woman Harold had just rejected, in front of the entire town. Amara said nothing more, but in her eyes a flicker of light returned. Not easy hope, but a quiet defiance. The game of power had begun. But this time the board would not be the same. No one at the station that day knew that Amara Wilson carried with her not just a suitcase and a broken heart. Hidden in that trunk was a secret, a legal weapon that, if revealed, could shift the entire landscape of Riverbrook's land ownership. A secret that would make Harold Pierce pay dearly for his prejudice. The Maxwell estate was nothing like Alexander had modestly described. It was a grand Victorian manor, surrounded by vast fields and quiet pastures where thoroughbreds grazed. The cobblestone drive was lined with ancient trees, and the ornate wrought iron gates opened into another world, where power and history walked side by side. Amara sat quietly in the horse-drawn carriage, taking in the scenery with a mixture of awe and caution. This man, was he truly kind, or simply another powerful figure using generosity as a way to signal his own values? "People here aren't used to difference," Alexander said, gesturing toward the main house. "Riverbrook is a town built by old families, living with the ideas of the past. Harold Pierce is just one of them, a symptom of a much deeper illness in this community." When the carriage stopped at the stone steps, the housekeeper came out to greet them. Mrs. Foster, a stately older woman with kind eyes and a composed demeanor, welcomed Amara with a gentle voice. "I've prepared the green room. It has the best view of the garden," she said, leading Amara through hallways lined with oil paintings and antique clocks, where every footstep echoed with the weight of old generations. That evening, in a dining room with soaring ceilings and soft yellow lighting washing over a long walnut table, Alexander shared his story. He was the son of a wealthy northern banker and a schoolteacher who had once marched for abolition. When his parents passed, Alexander inherited not just a fortune, but a set of ideals, principles of fairness he still carried. 15 years ago, I moved to Riverbrook. They called me an oddity. I was too rich to be excluded, but too different to be accepted. He took a sip of wine, then looked straight at Amara. And what about you, Miss Wilson? Harold must have been deeply taken by your letters to invite you all the way here. Amara hesitated, but there was something in Alexander's frankness that made her feel she could trust him. I'm a teacher. From Boston, I taught literature and history to young black girls. But the school was shut down. Budget cuts, I had to start over. She didn't mention that hidden inside the trunk beneath her bed, under a false bottom, was an inheritance from her late grandfather, a lifelong servant to a northern aristocratic family. That inheritance included not just a few gold coins, but a bundle of ancient legal documents. Land deeds that could upend the power structure of Riverbrook. The school closed for lack of funds, Amara said quietly, her eyes distant. And I knew it was time to begin again, somewhere new. But the full truth was more complicated. The real reason she had written to a potential suitor from afar was because of that legacy left by her grandfather, an inheritance few could imagine. Along with carefully saved money, he had passed on a packet of historical property claims. Documents that, if leveraged correctly, could rewrite the town's ownership map. In a place dominated by names like Harold Pierce, that truth was a weapon. The days that followed were strangely peaceful. Alexander didn't pry or propose anything. He gave Amara something rare in her life, space to think. The Maxwell Estates library was a treasure trove, floor-to-ceiling leather-bound shelves, filled with books on local history, regional geology, and land ownership law. Amara buried herself in those pages with a simple reason: I'm just expanding my knowledge. But word of her presence couldn't stay hidden for long. Within a week, the town buzzed with curiosity. Visitors to Maxwell's estate increased dramatically: merchant wives, a few clergymen, even some of Alexander's old friends suddenly found excuses to stop by. Look at this, Alexander murmured during one afternoon tea after seeing off yet another group. You haven't even stepped outside, and you've already become the center of the town's attention. Amara smirked, her gaze sharp. I've always been a center of attention, Mr. Maxwell. The only difference is now I'm holding porcelain instead of carrying the tray. On one such quiet afternoon, Harold Pierce appeared. He didn't announce himself. Hat in hand, face caught between false remorse and genuine unease. Maxwell, he said, voice unsteady. I just came to make sure Miss Wilson is doing all right. Alexander looked up from his book. Wonderful. Why don't you ask her yourself? Harold turned, catching sight of Amara as she entered the room. No longer the distressed woman from the train station, she wore a new dress tailored by Mrs. Foster, a deep, elegant blue that flattered her skin and confidence alike. No tremble, only calm command. Mr. Pierce, Amara said coolly. What a surprise. I mean, the community is concerned about your situation. How kind, Amara replied, her eyes fixed on his. Concerned about my situation or yours? Harold glanced nervously at Alexander, his voice shrinking. An unmarried woman staying in a man's home, especially when she's a black woman, Alexander finished quietly, his words steely. Go on, Pierce. I'd like to hear where you were headed with that. Harold swallowed, throat dry. The church committee is considering organizing a donation to help Miss Wilson return to Boston. Amara smiled, a cold, polite smile that never reached her eyes. Not gratitude, something closer to refined contempt. How generous! Unfortunately, I have no plans to leave. Harold's face fell. That's not acceptable. You don't know anyone here. No job, no family. I have a job, Amara interrupted, her voice calm but razor sharp. Mr. Maxwell has asked me to serve as his estate librarian. It seems the Maxwell family has been fond of collecting books for generations, but never found the time to organize them properly. The silence in the room thickened like honey. Harold turned to Alexander, his expression twisting, as though he'd bitten into something bitter. You can't be serious. She's managing your library? Alexander straightened, showing nothing but quiet pride. I've never been more serious, Harold. Miss Wilson is not only educated, but capable and principled. My library has never been in better hands. But Harold tried, but Alexander's gaze alone cut him off. There was nothing more to say. The voice and eyes of Riverbrook's most powerful man had spoken. What Harold and most of Riverbrook didn't yet realize was that Amara's role as librarian was more than just a title. The library wasn't merely a place for old novels or forgotten poetry. It was a vault, a record of the town's buried past, its land deeds, legal anomalies, and the forgotten truths that certain respectable families had tried to erase. Amara wasn't just a librarian. She held the keys to a truth her doubters didn't yet suspect. As Harold left, his steps were fast and heavy, like a man fleeing something unseen. His face flushed, part rage, part shame at having been exposed in front of an old friend, and in front of the woman he'd rejected. Alexander stood silently, eyes following Harold through the tall window. We'll try to make things difficult for you, Alexander said without turning. The wound you gave him today, it'll haunt him. Amara didn't answer immediately. She stepped toward the window, gazing into the distance, where the dust of the train yard had cleared, and the golden light of evening painted the fields beyond. Let him try, she said, voice low but resolute. While he's busy whispering cheap words to anyone who'll listen, I'll be digging, deeper than he ever imagined. Her eyes no longer belonged to a rejected traveler. They were the eyes of a strategist who had seen the whole board and knew exactly where her power lay. No one in Riverbrook knew that every hour Amara spent in the library served a clear purpose. Amidst the yellowing papers and dust-covered files, she was piecing together a complex puzzle, a harsh truth that the founding families of the town, including the Pierces, had built their legacies on lands they never rightfully owned. And while the town still whispered about the colored woman living at the Maxwell estate, Amara was already laying the foundation for a coming reckoning. 2 weeks later, the Riverbrook Town Hall was packed to the rafters. An emergency meeting had been called, drawing in all the old families, merchants, farmers, and local power players. At the center of the storm stood Harold Pierce, flailing his arms, his face red with fury. This is an outrage, he bellowed. Maxwell has openly defied our traditions by keeping that woman in his home. Respectable families are worried about inappropriate conduct. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room like a rising tide. But then, the hall door swung open. Alexander Maxwell walked in, calm and commanding as ever. Beside him was Amara Wilson, the woman who had once been whispered about, now walking with the grace of a queen in a soft silk dress, her gaze cool yet regal. Silence fell like a heavy curtain. The murmurs died. Every eye turned to Alexander Maxwell and the black woman beside him, who, no one could have predicted, was the center of today's storm. "Thank you for having me," Alexander began, his voice steady and clear, carrying to the farthest rafters of the old wood-paneled chamber. "But I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Ms. Wilson is not here as my guest. She is here as a legal representative in a matter that directly involves every person in this room." The murmurs returned, but this time laced with unease. Harold Pierce gave a dry, barking laugh. "A legal representative? Her?" He jabbed a finger at Amara, his voice cracking with both panic and rage. "A black woman? No degree, no title, no power? Have you lost your mind, Maxwell?" Alexander said nothing. He merely stepped aside, surrendering the floor to the woman beside him. Amara remained impossibly composed, not flinching under Harold's fury. She placed a leather case on the long table draped in red velvet at the room's center. With deliberate calm, she opened it, each motion rehearsed, measured, precise. The sharp click of the lock echoed like a whip crack in the stillness. "Actually, Mr. Pierce," Amara began, her voice ringing out with clarity and confidence, "in addition to being a certified teacher in the state of Massachusetts, I am also the lawful heir and appointed representative of the Freeman estate, specifically of Mr. Joseph Freeman, my great-great-grandfather." The name fell like thunder at noon. Joseph Freeman, a name buried for generations, now resurrected with full title and undeniable authority. Faces turned pale, some gasped, others leaned forward. Murmurs gave way to frantic whispers. "No, that's impossible," Harold blurted, his voice cracking under disbelief. "Joseph Freeman never existed. He was a myth, a ghost story, a legend for scaring children." Without blinking, Amara pulled out a yellow document bound in leather, its seal of red wax cracked but still intact. The parchment trembled in her hands with the weight of history. "Strange, then, Mr. Pierce," she said, eyes locked on his, "that I am holding the original land deed, signed by the governor of this state in 1866, granting legal ownership to Mr. Joseph Freeman." She raised the document high, letting those in the back see the embossed seal of the Commonwealth of Virginia and the official inscription, "Land deed, granted under Federal Act of Reconstruction, 1866. Judge Thornton, seated at the head of the council, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward to examine the document. The hall buzzed with rustling papers, held breaths, and creaking chairs. The judge muttered. "Old paper, authentic seal, ink matches the period, looks very real." "Forgery!" Harold suddenly screamed, voice cracking. "It's all fake, fabricated. You're losing control, Piers," one of the council members said, trying to sound neutral but clearly shaken. Amara said nothing. She calmly placed a second stack of documents on the table. Witness statements, archival records, even an audio recording of an interview with the grandson of Riverbrook's first preacher. No one spoke, but eyes shifted, suspicion turning to solemnity. For the first time in his life, Harold Pierce felt his power disintegrating, not with riots or noise, but with paper, facts, and a voice that never wavered. Amara stood firm. "I also have supplementary documentation. A full report on the forced exile of Joseph Freeman following an attempted lynching in 1870. Afterward, the so-called founding families divided his land amongst themselves, forming the Riverbrook Land Committee." Alexander stepped forward. "The Maxwell Library holds every land record in this region. Oddly, the records from 1870 to 1872 vanished until Miss Wilson discovered cross-referenced entries in unrelated archives." Reverend Miller, A silver-haired elder near the front bowed his head. My father once spoke of it, called it a sin buried too deep. Amara took a breath. I'm not here to punish descendants for the sins of their ancestors. I'm here to propose a solution, the establishment of the Riverbrook Community Trust, supporting education and housing for all residents. Harold scoffed. No one's buying this drama. At that moment the doors opened again. A man in a sharp suit stepped in, Jeff, a well-known attorney with credentials across 3 states. These documents have been verified by the State Historical Records Commission, he declared. They are authentic, and I'm here to inform you, formal litigation has been filed. Chaos erupted, yells, arguments, panic. Mid the uproar, Harold lunged toward Amara, as if hoping to silence the truth with brute force. You planned this all along, he shrieked. The letters were a setup. Amara stood her ground, her expression unchanged. No, Mr. Pierce. In my letters, I was just a lonely woman looking for connection. It was your reaction to my skin color that told me exactly who you are, a man who judged me and my ancestor for our darkness. Harold's face went ghostly white, his lips trembling. You'll ruin us. No, Amara said gently. I'm correcting a historical wrong. In the fairest way possible. The difference between us, Mr. Pierce, is that I've lived my life under prejudice. But I've never wanted to see anyone lose their home. Not even you. Harold collapsed into a chair, pale and speechless. The city council withdrew to deliberate. As they did, Alexander approached Amara, his eyes full of admiration and respect. You could take it all back, he whispered. Do what the land thieves once did. And become what they were to my grandfather? Amara replied. No, Alexander. Justice isn't revenge. It's the restoration of what's right. No one in that room that day, those who had dismissed her, laughed at her, underestimated her, could have imagined that the true transformation of Riverbrook would begin at that very moment. The echo that would linger in the town's halls of power would not be about a woman who came to destroy, but about someone who, despite being trampled, chose to rebuild, with dignity and vision. And as Harold Pierce bowed his head in silence, history began writing the first lines of a new chapter, one titled Amara Wilson. As Harold Pierce faced the complete collapse of his reputation and career, Amara Wilson and Alexander Maxwell exchanged a single glance, wordless but understood. A look that spoke not just of land or justice, but of a future where belonging was no longer dictated by skin color, but by character. 6 months after the historic town hall meeting, Riverbrook had changed. The Freeman Fund, established using assets reclaimed from historical injustices, had begun awarding scholarships to underserved students and financing community development projects. At the heart of it all was not the image of a vengeful figure, but a woman who had seen beyond pain to something greater, healing. The old store that once bore Harold Pierce's name was now Riverbrook's first public library, a bitter irony but a necessary one. The place that once silenced voices now preserved stories long forgotten. And Harold? He vanished from town without a word, selling off his assets for a fraction of their worth. Rumors said he now worked as a clerk in a small store in a neighboring town. His pride, once towering, had shriveled like the digits in his drained bank account. You could have destroyed him completely, Alexander said one crisp autumn afternoon as they walked through the garden, now transformed into a cultural center for the community. Others would have taken every last cent, he added. Amara only smiled, her gaze following children laughing across the lawn. a field once reserved only for the elite. Revenge would have satisfied me for a day, she said gently. But this, she gestured around them, this will make us proud for generations. The Freeman case soon drew attention far beyond Riverbrook. Journalists, historians, and scholars came from across the country, eager to document it as a symbol of historical justice. Amara was invited to speak at universities, where she not only told her story, but shared the legal process she used to recover the truth. At the celebration held in the Grand Hall of the Maxwell Estate, now officially renamed the Freeman Maxwell House after a modest but heartfelt wedding, Judge Thornton raised a glass, his voice thick with emotion. To the woman who taught us that justice is not just an idea in books, but something that must be practiced every day, he said, eyes shimmering. When Miss Amara came to our town, many thought they knew her from the first glance. But the lesson she taught is one we all needed to learn. Beside him, Martha Webb, the newly appointed principal of the community school, nodded vigorously. Come to think of it, she laughed, it all started with one cruel rejection at the train station. Alexander squeezed Amara's hand, a soft smile on his lips. Maybe the wisest decision Harold Pierce ever made was turning you away. Amara whispered, smiling faintly, though I doubt Harold would agree with that. In the old town square, once reserved only for honoring founding families, now stood a new monument. Not a grand statue, but a humble bronze plaque etched with a tribute to Joseph Freeman, a man who was stripped of his rights and whose land finally came back to serve the entire community. As night fell over Riverbrook, Amara sat on the porch of her new home, the city lights twinkling in the distance. She had once arrived here a stranger, a black woman deemed unworthy of belonging. And yet now, she wasn't just accepted, she was respected. Not because she had pleased anyone, but because she had stood firm, believed in the truth, and never surrendered her dignity. Alexander appeared with 2 cups of tea, sat beside her, and after a quiet moment smiled. You know what's ironic? Amara said, gazing out at the horizon. Harold rejected me because he couldn't imagine sharing his life with someone outside his narrow world, and that very refusal is what unraveled him. And what made you succeed was everything he despised, your strength, your roots, and your truth, Alexander replied. The lesson Riverbrook had learned and would pass down for generations was simple yet profound. When we judge others by appearances alone, we not only deny their humanity, we blind ourselves to the extraordinary they might bring. And as Amara Wilson Maxwell raised her eyes to the full moon rising above the town that once turned its back on her, she knew the real revenge was never about punishing Harold Pierce. It was building something so beautiful, just and enduring, that his rejection would forever remain nothing more than a footnote in a much greater story still being written.